Hello, welcome to Module 3 in Organizational Systems and Behaviors. And in this module, we're going to be talking about organizational communication. And I have to admit to you that I have to control myself a little bit in this module because OrgComm is really kind of my background. I was a few years ago, before we moved back to Nebraska, down in South Carolina, I was the chair of the Division of Communication, and particularly I taught courses in organizational communication and communication studies and things like that. So usually when I look at org behavior and organizational systems, as this class does, I'm coming at it from a communications perspective. And that'll probably make more sense as we go through this module, what I mean by a communications perspective. But so I'm going to try and keep these lectures short. I originally recorded the lectures for this module several years ago, actually, when I went back and looked at them. And I realized I talked too much. So I'm going to try and keep these a lot shorter for you. And also, it was funny, actually, going back and watching those old videos just to refresh myself, because they were all done pre-COVID. And so I'll make some comments in some of these situations where COVID has actually, I think, helped people understand the human aspect of organizations better. And I'll say more about that here in just a minute. So hopefully you have downloaded the slides for this module, the organizational communication slides. And you've got them pulled up there so that you can look at those as we go along. So jump right in. The first slide's the title slide, but then the second slide there you see is the communication model. And if you've been in any kind of communication class, public speaking class especially, speech class, anything like that, whether it was in high school or in your college days, or even if you attended like a public seminar, you've probably seen this model before. It's a pretty basic human communication process model that a lot of people use. And I mean, there's some slight variations here or there. I've seen several, and they're all pretty similar. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the individual components. I would just say this. I have my slides over here, that's why I keep looking. I would say this. There's a couple of important aspects of that I would draw your attention to. First of all, this model is pretty linear. It's pretty, in a way, mechanistic. So if you even think about the classical management viewpoints that we talked about in the previous modules, it's kind of that idea. And it also overall works well for kind of a public speaking kind of setting, which is where you usually see it being used, right? Because it's, as I said, it's a little bit linear. It's more, I guess, transactional. If you want to think about your leadership courses, your other leadership courses, when you think about transactional leadership versus transformational leadership, this is more of a transactional model. I speak, you listen, then you give me feedback, right? So it breaks down a little bit when we actually start using it for actual true human communication and interaction. But again, we'll build on that more as we go along. What I want to comment on with the model, a couple of things to draw your attention to would be especially the encoding and decoding part. If you'll notice, the sender encodes the message and then sends it, and then the receiver decodes the message. And what some models have, and I couldn't find one that had it reflected, if you were going to write on this model, I would tell you to write over the top of it 3 words, fields of experience. Fields of experience, or one word, context. And what I mean by that is this: our context or our experiences impact and affect the way we send, so the way we encode the message, and the way we interpret or decode the message. And so there's just something to be aware of, especially when we get into organizations and we're interacting with our peers, or we are the person in leadership and we're talking to those that we're leading, or we're interacting with those who lead us. There's always context. There's always fields of experiences, and that's going to affect the way that not only that we send the message email, text, verbally, right? What's the best way? But also the way that the message is received and interpreted and processed. So it's just something to always be aware of in our communication, particularly within our organizations. And then the other aspect of this that I would draw your attention to is that idea of noise. It's that kind of sunburst, starburst bubble there at the top. Noise is anything that interferes with our communication. And of course, when I teach speech class to high school students, I talk about 3 kinds of communication: physical, that's like hearing stuff, if there's actual noise going on; physiological, that's, inside of us. So I always use the example of you're in class and you're hungry, it's hard to concentrate. And then psychological. Psychological is probably the one that most impacts our organizational communication. We have to recognize that all of us have psychological noise going on all the time. If I come to a 8 o'clock meeting at work, I may have, the kids may have not have been real cooperative to get them out the door and get them to school or get them to daycare or things like that. Or I have something going on in my personal life. A loved one is sick or ill or right. I mean, people always have noise. Or it's hard for me to sit in a meeting and respect my boss because they just rip me up one side and down the other, right? All of that is psychological noise, and it's going to impact our communication within the organization with one another. So that's why I show you the model, just to again, kind of remind ourselves of that. It's not a perfect model when we get to organizational communication and interpersonal communication, but I think it's helpful to just kind of give us a frame. So then next, we ask the question, what is organizational communication? So it's not that linear kind of thing. I mean, again, that's helpful, but it's more than that. So what is organizational communication? Well, then the next slide, and you're going to be like, wow, you guys like icebergs. Well, I'll tell you this, in the OrgComm world, we really like metaphors. And you may have noticed that I like to use metaphors, analogies, stories. And for some reason, I don't know, maybe that's why, I don't know if I learned that in OrgComm or if I already like that, so it drew me there. But we really like this iceberg model when it comes to organizational communication. And I think it's incredibly helpful to think about it this way. So as you look at that iceberg, of course, what you know about icebergs, it's familiar. The vast majority of the iceberg is under the surface, right? You see an iceberg up in Alaska or something, you see it may look big on the surface, it's a lot bigger underneath. Well, that's the way to think about organizational communication. What you see, what the public sees, I guess, of an organization and how they communicate. It's like their marketing message, their websites, what they're posting on social media, then actual advertisements, or, if they do that, all of those kinds of things, that's the tip of the iceberg. And so as an OrgComm person, when we look at an organization, a general public person will look at an organization, point to it and say, that's what that organization is. We as OrgComm people, and also org behavior, but this is just this aspect of it, we look at it and go, not so fast. Because what we understand is there's a lot more that goes on under the surface. Even as a new employee, when you get hired onto an organization, your understanding is going to be that tip of the iceberg, right? And so again, what we're looking at is even things like mission statement, vision statement, value statements, all of those things that are really important. And we spend time talking about that. I think at least a couple of you may be in 939 with me this semester as well, EDD 939, strategic leadership. We spend a lot of time talking about mission, vision. Those things are important. But that isn't necessarily the reality. We hope it is as a person in the organization, but there's a lot more going on under the surface. And so from an OrgComm perspective, we want to dive below the surface when if we're in an organization, we're bringing this perspective to really understand how things go on. What are the processes? Who are really the gatekeepers and the key stakeholders and things like that? Um, and if I'm a consultant working with an organization, I'm going to really want to dig into that below the surface, because usually that's where your challenges and your problems are, because you're having difficulties in that aspect of your communication. Most organizations, most modern organizations, if they've been around a little while, they're pretty good as far as having a decent mission statement, vision statement, marketing, right? We all kind of understand that that's the world we need to be in. But what's really going on under the surface? So OrgComm's going to dig deeper and look at that. And our organizational systems and processes, that's what's going to be underneath the surface. So as we move forward in the semester, that's what we're looking at, is the under the surface things. So then I have a slide that gives you 3 definitions of organizational communication. And don't worry, there's no test in this course, so you don't have to memorize these definitions. I just give them to you as ways that people look at it, right? So you have that first one there from lumenlearning.com, the sending and receiving of messages among interrelated individuals within a particular environment or setting to achieve individual and common goals. It's a mouthful, but I do like some aspects of that. The interrelated individuals is a key part of that definition that I like. When we think about organizations, we want to think about those human relationships, and I'll say more about that in the next lecture for this section when we talk about the approaches to OrgComm. But that human interaction is a key aspect as we think about that. And if you remember the views of organizations, right, the container view versus the human interaction view. So I like that interrelated relationships. And I like the idea about looking to achieve individual and common goals. And that kind of resonates with me from a leadership standpoint. As a leader, we should be trying to help people achieve their individual and then group goals. And then you have 2 that came from businesscommunication.com. Scott says it's organizational communication is the process which involves the transmission and accurate replication of ideas ensured by feedback for the purpose of eliciting actions which will accomplish organizational goals. Not a big fan of that definition. I put it on there so that you see that is more of that classical management, traditional mechanistic approach to OrgComm. Because notice some key phrases in there. Transmission and accurate replication of ideas, and it is for the purpose of eliciting actions accomplishing organizational goals. There's no mention of individuals. There's no mention of, just people in there and things like that. So that's where I get a little, I'm not a big fan of that because it's more mechanistic. And then Goldhaber, the flow of messages within a network of interdependent relationships. Like that one a little bit better, although it's not real specific, but I like the idea of flow, because to me flow can go both ways, and I think that's a key aspect that we'll be talking about with communication, right? Communication is never just one way, that transactional. It's always transformational. We're all being impacted constantly by the communication, so I like that idea of flow there. And then I also, again, it's that same one from they call them interrelated individuals in the other definition, but this one says interdependent relationships. Again, that's that human interaction view, the interpretive view, which we're going to get to in the next lecture about OrgComm. So I like that idea of we are interdependent, right? It kind of removes that structure or that top-down feel that I feel like Scott's definition had there. So those are 3 ways, those are 3 definitions. There's a lot of definitions of organizational communication. But the next slide you'll see is the problem I have is all 3 of those leave out the constitutive aspect of communication in organizations, meaning a couple of them get a little bit there with the idea of interdependent, but the idea, the human interaction view of the organization, which is we as the members of the organization, in essence, we create the organization through our communication with one another. And so we'll get more into that concept and that idea in the next lecture, talking about the 3 approaches to OrgComm. So I'll see you in the next lecture.